Reaction to O.J. Simpson's death, pouring in. Even in death, Simpson is getting strong reactions, sparking outrage, including a first draft of his obit. Here's what went on. Simpson died Wednesday, age 76, following a battle with prostate cancer. After a successful football career, of course, and Hollywood career, Simpson was put on trial in 1995 for the murders of his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and Ron Goldman, her friend. He was, of course, acquitted. New York Times, though, drew the ire of readers shortly after publishing Simpson's obituary, and here's part of the reason why. He ran to football fame on the field and made fortunes in movies, okay? But his world was ruined after he was charged with killing his former wife and her friend, okay? That's the first draft there. That line after outrage was changed to, he ran to football fame and made fortunes in movies. His trial for the murder of his former wife and her friend became an inflection point on race in America. So it just always amazes me how this stuff goes apparently from one or even two or three people straight to the viewers or to the readers. There was another line within the piece that was changed from this, the infamous case which held up a cracked mirror to black and white America, cleared Simpson, but ruined his world. Again, that's the draft, to this. The jury in the murder trial cleared him, but the case, which had held up a cracked mirror to black and white America, changed the trajectory of his life. And so reaction from social media users was swift. Here's some of it. Mary at K1A9 Mom says, New York Times, I think Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman's lives were, quote, ruined when the deranged man murdered them. He is a murderer. He deserves no flowery prose to cover his crimes. Joe Walsh, you'll see it for yourself. What the New York Times, and that's how a lot of people were reacting. Meanwhile, over at The View, the ladies broke the news. It was their first story, and they wasted no time comparing the juice to Donald Trump. The host announced the news of Simpson's death at the start of the show. They discussed the famed Bronco chase. They remembered OJ's acquittal, where they were when he got off for the murders of his wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and Ron Goldman. Co-host Sunny Hostin then noted that she became a prosecutor in part because of this. She felt a great, quote, sense of injustice after the not guilty verdict. And then Joy Behar chimed in with this. Like Trump is found liable for rape. Same thing, Behar exclaimed to applause, alluding to a civil jury recently finding that the ex-president sexually abused and defamed writer E. Jean Carroll. And then Hostin joked, everything goes back to Trump, prompting Behar to reply, until he's gone, I will not rest. Daily Beast with that reporting. Others, though, who made a career off of this case early on, News Nation host Dan Abrams described a sense of guilt he carries to this day because of how Simpson's murder trial helped him gain prominence in media.
The murders of two people changed my life. It's kind of an odd thing to reconcile. I was doing my job, I think. I did it well enough, covering legal issues and developments around his cases. I was a legal reporter. But at the end of the day, it's also true. The deaths of two totally innocent people helped make my career. And I have guilt about that. I always have.
And I'd like to hear what both of you have to say about this because, with Dan Abrams, I'd like to say that people were just doing their job, and he did a fine job. He's a lawyer, whatever. But the OJ case, for those of us who lived through it, went in so many directions, twists and turns and specials, and actors. Remember in the civil trial, actors actually portrayed the witnesses because that was not allowed to be televised. Do you think that Abrams, and who am I to question, is not remorseful, but does carry that guilt with him? He did have a connection, I believe, to the Goldman family, particularly Ron Goldman's sister, Kim. But what do you think about his acknowledgement today?
Pausing here to deliver some honest truth as we do in our news coverage as well. TYT is facing challenges, guys, as the entire industry is. You know who could make the difference? You. If you hit the join button below, it's gonna make all the difference and keep us in business. We appreciate you, thank you. No, Dan Abrams totally not guilty. I don't know why he puts that on himself. He was just covering the trial. He didn't do anything wrong at all. And on the other hand, Alan Dershowitz today came out and said, well, I mean, I represented OJ, but I would have represented the Goldman family if they called first. Okay, so you're a sleazeball for hire. I got you. So what people have to remember about Alan Dershowitz and some of the other folks on that team were that they were not publicly appointed. They chose to represent OJ Simpson. In fact, my very first TV appearance was on CNN where I made that point to Johnnie Cochran. Now, the Johnnie Cochran situation, though, is a little bit different, and it's a good bridge to what my main point about OJ, which is that the main thing about the OJ trial was not OJ. OJ's a classic guy who was spoiled because he was an athlete at USC and given the whole world. Even in the obit, that's why you see the New York Times saying his world was ruined, right? And that's the world that he grew up in, where he was special and no one else mattered, right? But that is a very familiar story. What was interesting about the trial is that Black and white America, for the first time, began to realize they don't agree. Or at least white America began to realize that. Black America already knew that, right? But where they were like, it was a little bit cathartic. It was an FU to the system that had been so unfair to African Americans in this country. Not in a productive way, because OJ was very, very likely guilty, but it forced us to have that conversation. That's why it was so interesting, no matter what you thought of the verdict of that trial. Ramesh.
Yeah, several things. So, I think we can, those of us who were kind of alive at that time, it was all anyone could talk about. Remember that?
Yeah,
it was all anyone could talk about. And I think that speaks to sort of what has happened with media also over the last few decades, right? Something, we all are sort of like runs our lives, the internet kind of really came into being, I mean the web specifically, around that time period, and then more and more as time went on from then, heading into the mid to late 90s. So I think that led to more and more of a fragmentation of media, which doesn't mean that a story like OJ's wouldn't dominate, Twitter and social media. I think it would, but it was a different world where every single, of the few news networks that existed, all which were corporate, dominated, of course, at that time, we're all fixated on this story. I literally was in a physics class my first year at Stanford when I think when this news was happening, and I remember everybody in class was just sort of whispering in each other's ears about the verdict. It meant that much to us. But I think also related to what you just said, Cenk, it also speaks to how, yes, there was a spotlight on race in America, but part of the reason this got so much coverage, but to this day, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, George Floyd got coverage because of the brutal murder, but countless other working class, middle class, just anybody, everyday people, black and brown people, especially black folk, are murdered, and that doesn't get the same kind of coverage. I think it got a lot of coverage because, and it's evidence of an intersectional view to race. I know that's become like this right-wing goon talking point, but what does that actually mean? You need to read race through lenses of class and gender and amongst other categories, right? So OJ was like a celebrity, an extremely wealthy, black man who had a great amount of power and was clearly a man, So there's a reason why he got that kind of attention when the life of Rodney King didn't, even though the
that's a great point about Rodney King,
which is contemporaneous in that period, more or less, right?
Because
I will say though, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Sharon.
No, I was going to say that to me, what I think about most is it's a clinic in the way the media lacked and still does nuance.
Yeah.
The way they pointed that camera at those students in Howard University and hadn't a clue really about what they were cheering about. Nobody cared about OJ, who I know, who was black. OJ didn't care about black people that I know of, okay? He was very grateful for his white, rich celebrity friends and hanging out in Brentwood. He didn't give 2 cents about us. I guess like for me, looking back on it all these years later, I think what people didn't understand then was finally you see what it feels like when someone gets off and you don't matter. And then I feel so ugly because I think, yeah, but there were these two innocent people involved and it just sucks. But then I go back to thinking, the same people who are angry today and are spouting off on Twitter and social media about good riddance, they can't get over it after all these years. And I wonder what they said about George Floyd and, as you said, Breonna Taylor and Trayvon Martin and Sandra Bland and all these other people, if they just were angry about that, as ugly as it seems, it's an ugly back and forth that I'm doing internally, I think I would feel better about America because they would see something other than perhaps their own image and find value in it.
Yeah,
I agree.
So look, in a sense, you're describing me because you've seen us and it's on tape, rage about what happened to Trayvon Martin and George Floyd and dozens and dozens of horrific murders that have happened to African Americans in this country. And at the same time, rage against O.J. Simpson because truth matters and justice matters. It isn't about race, it isn't about partisan politics. Did he do it? Did he not do it? Were they innocent or were they not innocent? That's why the Rodney King point is so great because Rodney King, he did something wrong initially to start that conflict, but then he did not deserve that beating in any way, shape, or form. And so he was a person that people could have rallied around more so given the injustice that he suffered, whereas OJ never suffered any injustice, right? But guys, the most important part of this is that both things can be true. That OJ could be guilty, but that there is that pent up frustration of massive injustice against the African American community. So in that moment, it could feel a little cathartic for them. So when they showed that famous picture of Howard University students celebrating the acquittal that Sharon referred to, it was incumbent upon the press to clarify why they were cheering. All of those years of oppression and injustice, and this was a release valve. So that you could begin to understand that reaction. It wasn't because OJ was some sort of African American hero. Sharon's 1,000,000,000% right. He never cared about that community. Every time he had an opportunity, he would rush towards rich white people rather than the reverse. So hence he was the most ironic moment for that catharsis. So the catharsis can be real and OJ can be a terrible guy at the same time.
And also,
I can't imagine the families though. Guys, can you imagine Nicole Brown Simpson's your loved one, Ron Goldman, and like your loved one's vicious, disgusting murder is framed in a way that you're just like this byproduct. You're just like, the side dish or something. I just can't imagine how somebody could ever be at peace.
Yeah, and I think the lesson that we can take away from all of it is that this brutality towards African American people just keeps going on and on and on. And despite all of those protests that we engaged in a few years ago during the middle of the pandemic, what has been done? What's been done?
Yeah.
So, and that's just profoundly frustrating and for me.
Yeah. You know what? In the bonus episode, I'll tell you guys a thing that Ann Coulter told me last night. Already weird. That is related to what Ramesh just said, and you might be shocked at what she said about the reform. So because we've got to go over the bonus episode right now for the members, tyt.com/team to become a member. The link is always in the description box. And of course you could hit the join button below the video on YouTube as well. So yesterday we were debating immigration in Dallas. I rushed back in the morning to make sure that I could do the show with you guys today. And Barry Weiss was moderating, run by Free Press. There was two other people. Nick Gillespie's a well-known libertarian. He was on my side, actually, funny enough, on the immigration issue. Sohrab Ahmari is a Muslim immigrant from Iran. Very similar to my story, but he was against further immigration, which I thought was kind of convenient after he already made it in. But anyways, he's a good guy otherwise. He's a very nice guy in person. Ann Coulter, interesting. And I've debated her before on Politicon, and so I'm not gonna say too many kind words about her, because I'm not sure that she's earned it. And at the end, when they asked what was her favorite book, she said, Camp of the Saints, which is one of the most racist books in world history. Okay, but in a shocking twist, before we went on, we were talking about criminal justice reform. And she said, look, I agree with parts of it and disagree with parts of it. I was like, you agree with parts of it, interesting. And she's like, but how come they never reformed the prisons? She's like, why is it acceptable to have everybody like make fun of, put it in the movies, etc. Like, if you go to prison, you're gonna get raped. Which is a thing that I've said on the air. You've heard me say it like half a dozen times at least. She's totally, I can't believe it. I almost don't wanna say it. But she's totally right about that. That is such a weird thing that we never reform. The reason I brought that up is because we were talking about OJ and criminal justice reform. And we got some reforms that I'm not sure that we quite needed or wanted, and that's a big giant conversation, right? But we never got the ones we actually wanted, like police reform, on training and when to shoot and not to shoot, and prison reform that we desperately need. There were so many things that were absolutely essential that we never got, and then we got some rando stuff that is debatable. So this country is so frustrating sometimes. But anyways, I thought I'd share that with you guys because it was
fascinating.
Yeah, is that interesting? Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.